My name is Avery Sinclair. I am 28 years old, a violinist living in Chicago, Illinois. I never dreamed of boardrooms or corner offices. My world has always revolved around melody, not margins. I grew up in Oakwood Heights, a quiet suburb where every lawn was manicured and every facade gleamed with fresh paint. To anyone looking in, my family was the picture of success. My father, Jonathan Sinclair, was a senior partner at a prestigious law firm specializing in mergers and acquisitions. My mother, Claire Sinclair, designed sleek office towers as an architect for one of the largest firms in the city. They valued precision, professionalism, and planning, everything measured down to the last penny and the final detail. And then there was me, the daughter who picked up a battered violin at the age of 9 instead of a briefcase, the one who practiced scales in the attic until 3 a.m, waking to the echo of her own arpeggios. My parents never scolded me for the noise, but neither did they encourage it. It simply existed at the edge of their awareness, like a painting hung too high on the wall. My younger brother, Tristan, on the other hand, was the golden child. He graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern University with a degree in finance, then landed a coveted job at a hedge fund on Michigan Avenue straight out of graduation. At family gatherings, he held court regaling everyone with tales of high-stakes trades, 7-figure bonuses, and negotiations that reshaped entire industries. My parents beamed, their eyes gleaming with pride. Meanwhile, I sat quietly at the head of the table, my violin case tucked discreetly under my chair, wondering if anyone would ever ask what song I had in my heart. By the time I was 12, I was composing little pieces in a spiral-bound notebook. My mother would glance at the dog-eared pages once, ink smudged, corrections scrawled in the margins, but she never asked what the notes meant. My father would nod in polite interest when I mentioned a recital, but only as one might acknowledge that the neighbour's cat had knocked over a flower pot. There was no malice in their indifference, only a carefully maintained focus on stability and conventional markers of success. At 15, I scraped together money for my first proper violin, a second-hand instrument sold by a travelling musician at a street fair in Wicker Park. That violin became my sanctuary. When I played, I felt seen, each bow stroke unlocking a part of me the world refused to acknowledge. Yet every time I returned home, I reverted to the cautious child I had been taught to be. I spoke softly, made myself small, and waited for a letter of acceptance from some Ivy League university to arrive in the mailbox. Anything that would validate me in their eyes. I did not resent my family for their priorities. After all, they had sacrificed and worked tirelessly to provide security and comfort, but I could not help feeling like a curious afterthought in a life scripted by other people's expectations. It was in those moments of solitude, in my attic, under the yellow glow of a single lamp, that I understood the truth. I had spent most of my life yearning to be noticed by those who should have loved me unconditionally. That all began to change the night I met Elena Camacho. But that is a story for the next part. The first time I saw Elena Camacho, I was 23 and playing violin at a community showcase in Logan Square. My hands trembled as I lifted the bow, partly from nerves, and partly because I had spent the entire afternoon wondering if anyone in the audience would even listen. As I began the opening passage of my original composition, Echoes of Tomorrow, I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that only music could give. My fingers found their marks on the fingerboard, the wood singing beneath the strings. After I finished, there was polite applause. Nothing like the thunderous reception my brother Tristan's colleagues received at their corporate galas, but sincere nonetheless. I stepped off the small stage, heart still pounding, and made my way toward the folding chairs. Elena appeared at my side as if summoned by the last note. She was tall, with curly dark hair pulled into a loose bun, and wore a leather jacket splattered with paint, an outfit that looked equal parts practicality and rebellion. "Your melody has guts," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Eleanor. I run production at Sonar Studios." I swallowed, surprised she knew my name. I'm Avery. Thank you. Her grip was firm. Mind if I give you some feedback? I nodded, not trusting my voice. We slipped into a narrow hallway behind the stage where the buzz of the crowd faded. She closed her eyes as I replayed the piece in my head. You lean too much on technical precision, she began, and not nearly enough on raw emotion. Those 16th note runs were clean, yes, but they sounded like demonstrations, not declarations. She paced slowly from left to right, her boots tapping on the concrete floor. Try this. Play the same passage, but imagine you're speaking directly to someone who ignored you for years. Let the violin carry your hurt. Hurt. That word echoed in my chest. I closed my eyes and lifted the bow again. This time, I let the sound jag at the air, each note heavy with longing, each pause pregnant with unspoken words. When I finished, I looked up to find Elena studying me with a small, approving smile. Better, she said softly. You have something real in you, Avery. Don't hide it behind perfect runs. Then she turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the hallway, the echo of my own music still vibrating through my bones. A week later, I found myself standing outside Sonar Studios, the brick facade marred by graffiti and the door wrapped in posters for punk shows and poetry slams. Inside, it smelled of coffee, warm tape reels, and dust. Elena introduced me to Hank, her studio partner, a stocky man with a grey beard and ink stains on his jeans. He handed me a pair of headphones and showed me the mixing board. But it was Elena's advice I heard in every dial I turned. Over the next months, I became a fixture at Sonar. I swept the floors, organised sheet music, fetched drinks, and learned to operate the recording console. Elena taught me to listen for imperfections, the tiny hesitations, the subtle shifts in tone that made a take authentic. She encouraged me to record my own work there. On the same board where pop acts chased chart success, I laid down tracks for my first EP, Inside the Silence. The process was messy. Cables tangled around my feet, late-night editing blurred into early morning coffee runs, and I often questioned whether I had a place in that world. But whenever doubt crept in, Elena reminded me of our hallway moment, emotion over perfection. Then, one rainy Thursday, she handed me a commission. A young poet-rapper named Marcus needed strings on his demo. Can you write something that pulls at people's hearts? She asked. I nodded. Late that night, I drafted a violin line that wound around Marcus's verses like a lifeline. When he heard the playback, he closed his eyes and nodded slowly. That's exactly it, he whispered. In his breathing, I recognized the power of music to connect, to heal, to speak what words could not. And in that moment, I knew I had finally found where I belonged. Spring turned to summer, and Sonar Studios became my second home. My days started before dawn, hauling cables and tuning strings, and ended long after dusk, poring over takes until my eyes blurred. Elena and Hank trusted me more each week. I moved from assistant to co-producer on small sessions, learning to balance levels, EQ voices, and coax emotion out of even the shyest performers. One humid July morning, Elena burst into the control room, excitement in her eyes. "Avery, we've got a shot," she said, waving a contract. Local Arts Council wants to fund a pilot for underrepresented artists. Strings, beats, spoken word, you name it. They want us to produce a showcase album. My heart thudded. This was bigger than any single session. It was a platform for the very voices Sonar had championed. Poets, folk singers, experimental bands, artists who rarely made it past sound checks. Elena slid me a pen. "I want you on the creative committee with me." I hesitated, remembering the girl who once trembled before an audience of 10. Yet here I was, offered a voice in the project's direction. I signed without a second thought. Over the next weeks, we met in Sonar's break room. Whiteboard scrawled with artist names, budgets, deadlines. We debated track order, debated whether to remix or preserve raw takes, and curated an album that felt like a mosaic of Chicago's hidden talent. Hank handled logistics, securing rehearsal spaces and negotiating studio time. I mapped out string charts for Raina, a singer-songwriter with a smoky voice, and arranged call and response parts for Jay, a spoken-word artist whose poems burned with urgency. Meanwhile, at home, I juggled family obligations. My parents called less frequently, their inquiries rehearsed and polite. "How is the studio work going? Are you sure this is a viable path?" My answers grew firmer each time. I no longer apologized for my choices. Tristan still towered over me in success. New car, new apartment, new projects at the hedge fund. But our conversations had dwindled to obligatory holiday greetings. I accepted it, trading their approval for genuine passion. The Arts Council grant kicked in on a muggy August afternoon. We moved into a rented loft on West Kinsey Street. Concrete floors, high ceilings, no air conditioning, but vast windows that flooded the room with light. We forklifted in drums, amps, grand pianos, and a scattering of mismatched chairs. Eleanor and I eked out a makeshift lounge in one corner, threadbare couch, a bulletin board of album art dreams, and a tiny coffee maker that sputtered but kept us fueled. Our first session was with a guitarist named Milo, whose metal riffs contrasted with the dusty loft's industrial vibe. He blasted through his demo while sweat dripped down his neck. Elena nodded, then dialed back the distortion, layering in a plaintive cello line I wrote that softened the edges. When Milo emerged from the booth, he almost wept. "You turned my anger into something I can feel," he said, voice cracking. Those moments affirmed our purpose. As we neared completion, the album, titled Hidden Frequencies, took shape. 10 tracks, each a window into a different corner of Chicago's underground scene. We mastered the final mix just as summer's heat began to ease. I remember standing in the quiet studio, headphones on, listening to Raina's voice soar over my strings, Jay's words punctuated by gentle piano chords, and Milo's guitar dissolving into a wash of cello and ambient noise. It felt like a homecoming, my home being the place where every note mattered more than a ledger balance. That night, Eleanor and I toasted with cold sodas on the studio steps as dusk settled. "We did it," I whispered. She smiled, her eyes shining with relief and pride. "And this is just the beginning." I believed her. For the first time, I understood that my journey was never about proving my worth to others. It was about creating spaces where overlooked voices could finally be heard. The release of Hidden Frequencies felt like stepping onto new ground. We hosted the album launch at the Forge, a repurposed warehouse on the south side with exposed brick walls and strings of Edison bulbs hanging overhead. Flyers plastered around town promised Chicago's Unsung Voices, a Sonar Studio showcase, and, to our delight, attendance far exceeded our modest expectations. The crowd was a mix of curious locals, curious peers, and even a few music bloggers who'd caught wind of the Arts Council grant. Backstage, I paced in front of a full-length mirror, tuning my violin and mentally rehearsing introductions. Elena stood beside me, brushing back a loose curl of hair. "You good?" she asked. Her voice carried that familiar blend of challenge and care. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, let's do this." Our first act was Raina, draped in a burgundy shawl, her fiery eyes scanning the audience like a lighthouse beam. When the first chords of my string arrangement unfurled beneath her voice, I felt a rush of validation, not because my parents were watching, but because the room was utterly silent in reverence. Raina closed her eyes and let the music wash over her confession of heartbreak and hope. The applause afterward was immediate and heartfelt. Between sets, I helped Jay with microphone levels, careful not to spill my bottle of water in my nervousness. Jay's poems landed with quiet power, each word hitting the raised platform like a small insistence. I watched as his voice grew steadier, his posture less guarded, until finally he dropped the mic and raised his arms in triumph. The audience roared, Halfway through the night, I spotted a cluster of familiar faces stepping through the entrance. My parents in tailored jackets, Tristan checking his watch, and, my breath caught, my childhood friend Priya, who'd driven down from Milwaukee at my Wispari invitation. I hadn't told my family much beyond, "I'm doing a showcase," so their arrival both surprised and unnerved me. Roughly 300 chairs lined the floor, and they'd chosen seats dead center. My mother's expression was carefully neutral. My father's jaw was set. Tristan gave me a curt nod before settling back with arms crossed. I felt the old trembling in my hands, but pushed it aside. Tonight wasn't about them. It was about every artist who dared to believe in themselves when no one else did. The final act was Marcus, the rapper-poet whose demo I'd first signed strings to. He strode on stage in a faded hoodie, fretted guitar slung over his shoulder. At my signal, I drew the bow across the strings, weaving a simple melody that underpinned his words about struggle and survival. His verses cut like broken glass, yet at every turn my cello counterpoint offered a balm. By the time the final refrain rang out, confetti cannons exploded overhead, showering the crowd in metallic ribbons. Elena joined me on stage for the closing bow. We held hands, lifted them high, and the applause was deafening. It wasn't polite, it was joyous, it was real. In that moment, I glanced at my family. My mother's eyes shimmered. My father's shoulders had relaxed slightly. Tristan's stance had softened. Priya was clapping so hard her knuckles were white. I felt a beam of fierce pride swell up in my chest. This was proof that our work mattered. After the show, in the back hallway, I found Elena. She squeezed my arm. "You okay?" she asked. I laughed, tears prickling. "Better than okay." My phone buzzed. 2 missed calls from my mother and a text. "Thank you for showing us who you really are." I stared at the message, feeling the old wounds start to heal. We spent the rest of the night packing gear, congratulating artists, and celebrating with takeout pizza and lukewarm sodas in the makeshift lounge. Around 1 o'clock, the studio cleared out and only Elena and I remained. I sat on the threadbare couch, violin in hand, and played a soft, winding melody, a song of gratitude and new beginnings. Elena closed her eyes, leaning her head on my shoulder, humming along until her voice joined mine. Later, as we turned off the last lights and stepped into the late-night air, I realized something profound. I had built a life where I no longer needed to shrink myself to fit a mold. My music, my choices, and the community we'd created were enough, and the family I once tried so desperately to impress had finally shown up to witness it. Elena looked at me, the city lights dancing in her eyes. "What now?" she whispered. I smiled, sliding my arm around her. "Now, we keep going." The morning after our showcase was a blend of exhilaration and exhaustion. Eleanor and I arrived at Sonar Studios around 10 a.m., greeted by the lingering scent of confetti and the rumble of equipment carts in the hallway. We had a full day of follow-up to tackle, returning borrowed gear, sending thank you emails to the Arts Council, and fielding interview requests from local press. I poured us both coffees, black with a hint of cinnamon, while Elena powered up her laptop. "Look at these numbers," she said, swiveling her screen toward me. Analytics from streaming platforms, social media engagement, even requests for master files were spiking. Comments flooded in. "I've never heard anything like this. You're changing the game. My story needs Underdog music." It felt unreal that so many strangers connected with our artists' raw expressions. Yet, beneath the excitement, lurked a gnawing worry. We'd invested nearly all of our grant money into hidden frequencies. Studio rentals, promotional materials, a modest stipend for each artist. Now, with expenses paid and only a slim cushion left, we needed to secure new funding to sustain operations. I glanced around the control room, at the rack of vintage microphones, the scattering of notebooks, the chipped bass amplifier leaning against the wall. This was home, but it came with rent, utilities, and payroll for our small team. If we didn't land something soon, Sonar's doors might have to close. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from a representative at Lakeview College of Music, an institution known for its classical standards. They'd seen the feature on Hidden Frequencies and wanted to discuss a possible residency program. I held my breath as I read, "We believe Underdog Music's mission aligns with our commitment to community outreach. Would you be open to a partnership?" I looked at Elena, heart racing. "That's huge," I whispered. She nodded, eyes shining. "Let's set up a meeting." Over the next week, we prepared a proposal, a semester-long workshop series where our Sonar team would mentor emerging artists in composition, production, and self-promotion. We outlined budgets, schedules, potential venues, and learning outcomes. I wrote the section on curriculum, how to infuse personal narrative into arrangements, how to navigate digital distribution platforms, how to channel rejection into creativity. Elena detailed logistics and staffing. We practiced our pitch until it felt second nature. The presentation took place in Lakeview's polished conference room, complete with a long mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the campus quad. I wore a crisp button-down shirt for the first time in months. Elena opted for a tailored blazer over her trademark leather jacket. We began with our backstory, 2 underdogs who built a collective from the ground up, then played audio clips of Hidden Frequencies. Raina's voice soaring, Jay's words resonating, Milo's guitar declaration. By the end, a small crowd of faculty and administrators sat forward in their chairs, nodding appreciatively. When we finished, there was a brief silence. Then the dean leaned forward. "This is exactly what our students need," she said. Real-world experience, genuine community engagement, and a fresh perspective on music as storytelling. Hands shook, pens scribbled, and within 15 minutes, we had a letter of intent in our hands. Driving back to the studio, Elena let out a whoop that startled me. "We did it!" she shouted, weaving through traffic with her trademark recklessness. I laughed, relief washing through me. We did it. That afternoon, we drafted an email to our artists, an announcement of the Lakeview residency, details on schedules, and an invitation to enroll. Responses came almost instantly. Gratitude, excitement, questions about logistics. Marcus wrote, "Thank you for believing in me. I can't wait to teach and learn." Raina said she'd bring sheet music and stories from her heritage. Milo already had riff ideas for workshop exercises. As I read each note, I felt the familiar ache of disbelief. The same girl who once trembled before 10 listeners was now coordinating a college-backed program that would impact dozens. I closed my laptop and stretched, the afternoon sun painting the studio walls gold. Elena touched my shoulder. "What's next?" she murmured. I smiled, gazing at our bustling workspace. "We keep building. One song, one story at a time." Autumn slid into Chicago with a crisp edge, draping the city in crimson and gold. The Sonar Studios, our brick-lined sanctuary, hummed with renewed purpose. The Lakeview residency kicked off last week, and I'd spent every evening crafting lesson plans, curating playlists, and rehearsing lectures on everything from mic placement to licensing rights. Eleanor, ever the force of nature, negotiated with campus administrators, scheduled studio slots, and even arranged for campus radio to broadcast our students' showcase. One Tuesday afternoon, I headed to Lakeview's Thompson Hall, a venerable stone building where ivy clung to gargoyles and history whispered through cavernous corridors. Carrying my violin case and a stack of handouts, I climbed the marble stairs and entered a sunlit classroom. Half a dozen students sat at desks with laptops and notebooks, faces a mix of eagerness and nerves. I introduced myself and began with a simple exercise. Close your eyes, think of a moment when you felt invisible, and play that on your instrument or through your voice. No judgment, only honesty. Silence fell. Then, lightly at first, tentative melodies and hushed words filled the room. A cellist named Marcus Edge confessed he'd felt overlooked in his family of lawyers. A rapper named Nyla Mays spoke truths about identity and belonging. I guided them, adjusting dynamics, encouraging breath, reminding them that vulnerability was their greatest asset. When the bell rang, students lingered, eyes bright, voices raw with emotion. For the first time, they weren't just playing notes, they were sharing pieces of themselves. Back at Sonar, I found Elena and Hank in a heated debate over scheduling. The grant application deadline loomed, and we needed to secure matching funds to expand our reach. I pulled up a chair. Maybe we approach the Chicago Arts Foundation, I suggested. They've funded grassroots music initiatives before. Eleanor considered it. It's worth a shot. That night, as I walked home beneath amber streetlights, I reflected on how far I'd come. I remembered how my heart had pounded at my first recital in Logan Square, how I trembled when Elena first offered feedback, how I'd questioned every choice until this moment, standing between parallel worlds of uncertainty and possibility. The next morning, I drafted our proposal to the Chicago Arts Foundation, an ambitious plan for mobile recording workshops in underserved neighborhoods, pop-up concerts in community centers, and scholarships for young musicians. I wove in stories from our residency, students who found their voices, artists who discovered new genres, moments of unexpected connection. When I hit send, I felt a surge of hope tempered by the knowledge that we'd need more than passion to win this. 2 days later, I sat in a coffee shop on Wabash Avenue, sipping a latte and scrolling through emails. My phone pinged. "Congratulations! Your proposal has been approved for funding. Await details on the grant agreement." I stared at the message, disbelief coursing through me. Then I looked around. The baristas at work, the chatter of strangers, the autumn breeze swirling leaves outside, and realized how many lives our little studio could touch. I jumped to my feet, nearly toppling my chair, and dashed to call Eleanor. Her voice on the line was a mix of excitement and relief. "We did it, Avery," she said, laughter cracking through. "We really did it." In that moment, I felt the invisible cloak of my past fall away. I wasn't just the daughter of high achievers who never understood me. I was Avery Sinclair, co-founder of Underdog Music, mentor, musician, catalyst, forging spaces where overlooked voices could thrive. That afternoon, I drove back to Lakeview, eager to share the news. As students greeted me at the door, I saw in their faces the same wonder I once felt. The realization that someone believed in them, that their stories mattered, and I understood, more deeply than ever, that true success isn't about fitting a prescribed mold. It's about creating new ones for the ones who come after. Winter arrived early in Chicago, painting the streets white and turning breath into clouds. The hum at Sonar Studios slowed to a mindful rhythm as we focused on the mobile workshops funded by the Chicago Arts Foundation. I spent mornings packing cases of microphones, cables, and portable keyboards into my aging hatchback. Elena organized routes to community centers in Englewood, Pilsen, and Austin, the neighborhoods too often overlooked by mainstream music programs. On a frosty Thursday, I pulled up to the Harold Washington Library's auditorium, greeted by a group of teenagers clustered near the stage. They eyed my violin case with curiosity. I introduced myself, then unpacked a keyboard and handed out headsets. "Today," I told them, "we're going to build a track from scratch. Your lyrics, your rhythm, and a melody to carry your voices." At first, silence reigned. Then a boy named Jamal hesitantly tapped out a beat on the keyboard. A girl named Sophia, her jacket dotted with piano key stickers, leaned in and added a bass line on the violin. Encouraged, I layered a simple string motif beneath their tentative voices. They traded lines. Jamal rapped about late-night lights on empty avenues. Sophia sang of dreams, deferred and daring to hope. By the end of 2 hours, we had a rough yet vibrant demo that echoed with authenticity. They beamed at one another, proud of their creation. Driving home, my fingers still tingled from the day's session. These workshops reminded me why we started Underdog Music: to give artists who never saw themselves on a stage the tools to own their stories. Back at the studio, we spent evenings polishing the demos for digital release, learning to balance our own creative projects with these community commitments. One evening, as I was packing up a set of violins after a late session, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I answered and heard a tentative voice say, "Hello, this is Marisol Rivera. I produced your showcase at the Forge last year. I have a lead on a regional performance slot for one of your artists." I recognized Marisol's name from a local music column. My heart leapt. She explained that the Chicago Winter Festival had an open slot for indie acts, and she thought we should submit Hidden Frequencies artists as a collective. Elena and I huddled over the festival application that night, selecting 3 standout performers: Raina with her soulful ballad, Marcus's spoken word fusion, and Nyla's rap-infused poetry. We recorded a live set demo in the studio, capturing the raw energy of our previous performances. By midnight, the application was sent. Weeks passed in a blur of sessions and lesson plans. Then, on a snow-laden Monday, an email arrived. "Congratulations! You have been accepted to the Chicago Winter Festival main stage." The acceptance felt surreal. Another confirmation that our underdog spirit resonated beyond the walls of Sonar. As we prepared for the festival, I found myself reflecting on my own journey. I remembered trembling backstage at Logan Square, the apprehension in my chest. Now, I would step onto the Winter Festival stage as both performer and producer, leading a group of artists who once felt invisible. The night of the festival, our crew gathered in the green room, 6 performers plus Elena, Hank and me, all bundled against the cold. My parents surprised me by showing up, scarves wrapped tightly, eyes bright despite the winter chill. They didn't speak much, but the pride in their expressions was unmistakable. Tristan gave me a firm hug, his voice low. "You've done something incredible." Out on stage, under glittering lights and before a packed house, I introduced our collective, Underdog Music. One by one, our artists took the spotlight, weaving beats and strings into stories of struggle and triumph. When I joined them for our finale, playing a soaring violin line over Nyla's final verse, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. In that moment, amid the cheers and applause, I realized that success isn't a solitary achievement. It's the harmony of every voice we uplift, every story we amplify. As the snow drifted outside, and chants of "Underdog, Underdog" filled the air, I knew this was only the beginning of our journey, and that no matter how far we travelled, we would carry these moments of connection with us, always. Spring thawed the city's winter frost, and with it came fresh challenges and opportunities for Underdog Music. Our triumph at the Winter Festival had opened doors, but it also raised expectations. As I unlocked the heavy Sonar Studios door one Monday morning, I felt the familiar stir of anticipation and a twinge of anxiety. Elena greeted me with a broad grin. "We've been invited to SXSW, she announced, her voice vibrating with excitement. "They want us on a panel about DIY labels and community building, plus a late-night showcase slot." I sucked in a breath. South by Southwest in Austin was every indie music professional's dream. For a collective born from nothing more than passion and grit, this was huge. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning. We crafted our panel presentation, highlighting our journey from sweaty loft sessions to festival stages. I distilled our core philosophy, authenticity over perfection, community over commerce, into concise talking points. While Elena wrangled logistics, travel itineraries, gear rental, promotional artwork, we recruited 3 of our most compelling artists, Raina, Marcus, and Jay, to perform our showcase set in a repurposed warehouse venue, a nod to our Chicago roots. Back home, I continued teaching my Lakeview residency classes, and leading mobile workshops. But my nights were consumed by rehearsal. I reharmonized string parts for the showcase, experimented with cello effects for Marcus's verses, and coordinated with our sound engineer friend, Simone, who agreed to mix our live set on site. Together, we mapped out lighting cues, stage layouts, and wardrobe choices to ensure our performance reflected Underdog Music's raw, unvarnished aesthetic. Meanwhile, I faced a quieter struggle of my own, reconciling my identity as both artist and entrepreneur. Late one evening, I found myself staring at my reflection in the studio's glass booth, violin in hand. I remembered the little girl who trembled before an audience of 10 and wondered if I'd lost touch with the pure joy of playing. Had I become too focused on metrics, streaming counts, grant dollars, press mentions, instead of the music itself? I voiced my doubts to Elena over coffee in our makeshift lounge. She listened, eyes soft. "You're still you," she said. "You built this so artists like you could thrive. Don't let success scare you into forgetting why you began." Her words grounded me. I realized that my leadership role and my artistry were not opposing forces, but complementary ones. The same passion that drove me to build Underdog Music also fueled my love for the violin. When our flight touched down in Austin, the warmth felt like a welcome reprieve from Chicago's lingering chill. We arrived at the SXSW venue, a cavernous warehouse buzzing with industry folk, press, and musicians testing new pedals. Backstage, I paused for a moment, violin case strapped over my shoulder, and imagined the Avery who once dreamed of being seen. That girl would never have believed this far she'd come. Our panel discussion drew a diverse crowd, label owners, festival directors, and hopeful artists scribbling notes. Elena and I shared our sliding scale payment model, our mobile workshop strategy, and the importance of mentoring overlooked voices. Questions ranged from revenue streams to mental health in the DIY scene. I answered, drawing on our shared experiences, and felt a surge of pride when someone in the back applauded mid-discussion. That night's showcase was a blur of intensity. The warehouse stage was framed by string lights, the air thick with anticipation. Rayna's opening ballad brought the room to a hushed reverence. Marcus's fusion of poetry and cello rattled the rafters. Jay's final piece, a defiant anthem of self-acceptance, had everyone on their feet. When I stepped forward for my violin solo, I closed my eyes and let the music speak, a melody of struggle, resilience, and the echo of every unheard voice that led me here. Afterwards, as we packed our gear under neon glow, I realized that success was not a destination, but a continuum of moments like this. Vulnerable, exhilarating, and deeply human. And as we boarded the red-eye back to Chicago, I carried with me the reaffirmation that our story, and the stories we uplift, would continue to unfold, one honest note at a time. Spring in Chicago slipped into an equally capricious April, alternately sunlit and stormy. Back at Sonar Studios, Elena and I found ourselves at a crossroads. We'd built momentum through showcases and residencies, but the next step, sustainable growth, remained elusive. Our remaining grant funds dwindled faster than anticipated, and although Lakeview College's residency provided a modest stipend, we needed new revenue streams to keep Underdog Music alive. One Monday morning, as I warmed up my violin and reviewed our budget spreadsheet, my phone buzzed with a LinkedIn notification. It was from a name I'd never expected. Dr. Simone Patel, Director of the Chicago Public Library's Youth Arts Initiative. The message read, "Avery, your work with Sonar Studios and Underdog Music aligns with our mission to empower young creatives. Would you consider a partnership to integrate music production workshops into our summer programs? Let's discuss." My heart pounded. A partnership with the public library could mean access to dozens of community branches and hundreds of teens eager for creative outlets. I clicked reply almost before I realized it. Absolutely. I'd love to explore how we can bring Underdog Music to CPL's summer series. Within 48 hours, Elena and I sat around a polished oak table in the library's Lakeshore branch. The room smelled faintly of old volumes and fresh paint. Dr. Patel, a gracious woman in her early 40s, outlined a pilot program. 6 workshops spread across 3 branches, covering basic recording techniques, songwriting fundamentals, and live performance coaching. The budget they proposed covered equipment rental and a small honorarium for our instructors. It wasn't lavish, but it was real. As we hashed out schedules, Tuesday evenings for songwriting labs, Saturday afternoons for recording sessions, I felt a familiar thrill of possibility. At last, Underdog music would have multiple touch points across the city, reaching communities that rarely saw themselves reflected in mainstream arts programming. That Saturday, I gathered my gear and drove to the Austin branch of CPL. Tables were pushed aside to make room for fold-out chairs, and curious teens milled about, clutching notebooks and smartphone recorders. I introduced myself and began with a simple icebreaker. Tell me your favourite song and why it matters to you. Responses ranged from Beyoncé's Halo to local drill rap, each story revealing a personal connection. An anthem played on repeat through Heartbreak, a beat that helped someone feel safe in their bedroom. I divided them into small groups and assigned each a short songwriting prompt. Write 3 lines about a moment when you felt invisible. Their pens hesitated, then scribbled with urgency. We reconvened, and one by one they read aloud. I faded into the back seat as my family cheered for a stranger's praises. My voice trembled in the school choir, but no one noticed my fear. I practiced guitar in the attic, praying the world would someday listen. Then I taught them how to turn those lines into a verse, how to set them to a simple chord progression, and how to layer a melody on top. We recorded scratch takes on a portable USB interface, then listened back through headphones. Their eyes widened at the playback. This was their truth made audible. After 2 hours, we ended with a feedback circle. I reminded them that vulnerability is their most powerful tool and encouraged them to keep writing even after the workshop ended. As they filed out, a boy named Dante lingered. "Thank you," he said quietly, tears in his eyes. "I never thought my words mattered until today." Driving back to Sonar, I reflected on how far I'd come, from a quiet teenager composing in an attic to someone helping others find their voices. That night, I poured 2 cups of tea, sat in Elena's makeshift lounge, and shared Dante's words. We toasted to new partnerships and to every young artist who, like me, felt unseen for too long. In that moment, I understood that Underdog Music wasn't just a company, it was a movement. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, I felt more certain than ever that our work would continue to resonate, transforming silence into stories, one note at a time. Summer in Chicago brought sweltering days that pressed against the studio windows and sent sidewalks shimmering. Sonar Studios pulsed with renewed energy as we launched the Chicago Public Library partnership. But amid the excitement, a personal crossroads emerged. I realized I hadn't recorded anything for myself in months. My violin had been my voice, yet I'd spent so much time amplifying others that my own melodies lay silent. One humid evening, after wrapping up a CPL workshop in Bronzeville, I lingered at the front desk long after the teens had gone. The clack of my violin case closing echoed in the empty hall. I pressed my palm against the cool countertop and asked myself a question I'd avoided for too long. What story do I still need to tell? That question followed me back to the studio. I found Elena poring over mixing notes for Jay's upcoming EP. "Can I borrow some studio time tomorrow morning?" I asked softly. She looked up, tired yet trusting. "Of course. You need it." At dawn, I returned alone, unpacking my violin and setting up a single condenser mic. The unfamiliar stillness gave me pause. I closed my eyes, drew the bow across the strings, and let the first notes tremble in the air. an improvisation born of months of pent-up longing. I played for myself, not for grants or schedules, letting each phrase carry its own question and answer. By mid-morning, I had sketched 3 movements, one of memory, one of reckoning, and one of hope. I recorded rough takes, then switched to piano for harmonic support I'd neglected in live sets. As the sun climbed, I worked through mistakes, subtle shifts in tempo, and whispered half-phrases that felt too intimate for any audience but my own. When I finally sat back and listened to the session playback, I recognized something familiar beneath the polished engineer's ear. It was me, Avery Sinclair, the musician who once trembled in Logan Square. Her voice had returned, shaped by every workshop, every festival, every late-night session with Elena. That afternoon, I presented the recordings to Elena. She pressed play and, halfway through the first track, leaned forward. Tears glistened in her eyes. "This is you," she said, "undiluted." Her words resonated more deeply than any review or grant approval. I realized that self-expression wasn't a luxury but a necessity, that my own creative journey was the wellspring from which all our collaborative work flowed. Over the next weeks, I polished the 3-part suite, Invisible to Infinite, and added subtle string overdubs and piano counterpoints. I enlisted Simone to master the tracks, ensuring they retained the warmth and intimacy of those dawn sessions. Then, quietly, I released the suite online, sharing it first with our core Underdog community and then publicly. Reactions were immediate. Colleagues messaged that the music felt like a confession they could relate to. Workshop students wrote that they heard their own stories in the melodies. Even some of our patrons on social media reached out, saying they'd felt seen for the first time. Behind the scenes, this personal project rekindled something essential in me: the joy of creation without obligation. It reminded me that to nurture others, I must also nurture myself. And as both artist and entrepreneur, I understood that authenticity was our greatest asset. Whether teaching teens in a library or releasing my own music to the world. That fall, I scheduled a small dawn session showcase at Sonar, inviting artists, friends, and even a few parents. At 6:30 in the morning, the studio lamps glowed softly as I performed Invisible to Infinite. My parents sat in folding chairs, their expressions a blend of curiosity and pride. After the final note faded, they rose, tears on my mother's cheeks, a genuine standing ovation following. In that moment, light filtering through dusty windows, applause echoing off brick walls, I knew our journey wasn't measured by grants or festival slots alone. It was measured by moments of connection, the sounds we shared, the stories we unlocked, and the courage to finally play our own songs. Winter slipped back into Chicago, and Sonar Studios buzzed with fresh energy. After my dawn session showcase of Invisible to Infinite, our community had rallied around Underdog music more fiercely than ever. Workshop enrollments doubled, and local press raved about the authenticity of our approach. Yet, as I flipped the calendar to December, a new challenge emerged: how to sustain momentum without burning out. One frosty morning, as I brewed tea in our loft-style studio kitchen, Eleanor appeared holding an official-looking envelope. "It's from the National Endowment for the Arts," she said, excitement and trepidation mingling in her eyes. "They want to discuss a major grant, enough to fund Underdog music for the next 2 years." I felt my breath catch. A multi-year grant would transform our operations, enabling us to hire full-time staff, upgrade equipment, and expand beyond Chicago. But with opportunity came pressure. Over lunch, Elena and I pored over the grant criteria, community impact metrics, detailed budgets, strategic goals, and a requirement for a governance board. It wasn't simply about passion anymore. It was about formalizing our vision into deliverables. I sipped my tea, stomach knotting. Did I want to trade our scrappy independence for institutional stability? That afternoon, I sought counsel from Dr. Simone Patel, whose library partnership had been our most successful community outreach. I found her in the CPL's Lakeshore branch, surrounded by stacks of sheet music and neon posters for youth concerts. We sat at a round table beneath frosted windows. "Congratulations," Simone began, beaming. "A grant like that could give Underdog music wings. But remember why you started." I nodded. I worry about losing our essence, turning into another bureaucratic agency. She tapped her pen thoughtfully. "Structure can be a tool, not a trap. You can build safeguards, terms in your bylaws that protect creative autonomy, advisory roles for artists, and a commitment to low-barrier access." Her words mapped a path forward. Accept the grant, but codify our core values into governance. Buoyed by that advice, Eleanor and I met late into the night drafting articles of incorporation. We outlined a 5-member advisory board, 2 artists, a community leader, a financial officer, and 1 rotating seat for a workshop alumnus. We inserted clauses guaranteeing sliding scale fees, free sessions for underprivileged youth, and annual peace and play days when the studio opened its doors for gratis collaboration. By dawn, bleary-eyed but determined, we had a framework that both elevated Underdog music and preserved its soul. Weeks later, I found myself before a panel of NEA reviewers in Washington, D.C., a historic marble hall humming with bureaucratic formality. Clutching notes, I shared our journey. A violinist overlooked by her family, a chance meeting with a fearless producer, the creation of a grassroots collective that gave hundreds of artists their first platforms. I emphasized our governance safeguards and showcased recordings from Invisible to Infinite and Hidden Frequencies. When I finished, I offered my violin for a brief demonstration, a solo improvisation beneath lofty pillars. The notes reverberated, carrying the raw spirit of every workshop, every midnight session, every risk we'd taken. 2 weeks later, we received the news. The grant was approved. In a handwritten letter, the NEA praised our innovative model for community-centered music production and commended our commitment to creative equity. Back in Chicago, Elena and I hugged in the empty studio, our desks cluttered with paperwork, and whispered, "We did it." The infusion of funds allowed us to hire our first full-time engineer, Maya, a jazz bassist with a sharp ear and a warm laugh. We set up a scholarship fund for aspiring producers and rented a second space in Evanston for weekend workshops. Yet, even as we grew, we honoured our promise. The sliding scale policy remained in force, mobile workshops continued, and our advisory board met quarterly in the same break room where Elena once told me, "Emotion over perfection." That spring, as I prepared for the annual Underdog Music Showcase, this time in a spacious theatre downtown, I reflected on the journey. From the trembling girl in Logan Square to the studio founder negotiating national grants, I had learned that growth need not mean betrayal of values. It could mean amplifying them. On the night of the showcase, amid soaring arias and raw rap verses, I spotted a familiar face in the audience. My brother, Tristan, tears glistening under the stage lights. In that moment, I realized that success was not an end point, but an invitation to keep building, keep creating, and keep opening doors for the invisible voices waiting in the wings. And as I lifted my violin for the final bow, I felt the weight of every story that had led me there, all the unseen notes finally heard. By midsummer, Underdog music had settled into a rhythm that felt both ambitious and sustainable. Our new Evanston space thrummed with activity, weekend workshops on composition, weekday sessions for podcast scoring, and even a small in-house livestream series we called Late Night Voices. Each morning, Eleanor brewed us tea in the kitchenette, filled with plants and a whiteboard scribbled with upcoming deadlines and creative prompts. I arrived early to prep my violin and review lesson plans for the day's songwriting cohorts. One Tuesday, as I was demonstrating a modal progression to a group of adult learners, My phone buzzed with an unexpected message from Priya, my childhood friend who once drove down for my debut showcase. Hey, thinking of bringing my little art collective by for a remix session next week? They've got some cool experimental tracks. Want to collaborate? I smiled, remembering how far we'd both come. Absolutely. Let's set it up, I replied. That weekend, the Prismatic Collective arrived, a 5-piece ensemble blending spoken word, electronic pulses, and field recordings. They spilled into the studio with laptops, sequencers, a saxophone, and a camera to document the process. I guided them through setting up a live sampling patch, while Priya captured their reactions on film. Elena lobbed in production tips, reverb here, EQ there, and soon we transformed their skeletal demos into textured soundscapes that felt both avant-garde and deeply human. By the time they left, they were already planning a joint live show with Underdog artists, proof that our inclusive approach could spark creative cross-pollination. Back at my desk that Monday, I found an email from an indie label in Berlin, expressing interest in licensing hidden frequencies for European distribution. My chest tightened with excitement and nerves. Negotiating international rights felt like stepping into unknown territory. I looped Elena in, and we spent evenings researching contracts, exchange rates, and cultural considerations, how to respect local scenes while preserving our artists' authenticity. Weeks later, we signed a modest licensing agreement, trusting that our Underdog spirit would translate overseas. Meanwhile, I continued personal practice, sometimes sketching new violin riffs, other times sitting at the piano to explore harmonic textures for a potential second solo EP. I realised that my own creative journey needed space alongside our collective's growth. So I blocked off Friday mornings as studio-only time, reminding myself that self-expression was not selfish, but essential. That commitment bore fruit 2 weeks later when I premiered a brand new piece, Wire and Water, during our live stream series. Its opening measures, delicate pizzicato over rippling piano, hinted at fragility, while its climactic crescendo of layered strings and vocal hums spoke of resilience. Chat responses flooded in. This feels like summer rain. You captured longing in every note. I'm tear-stained but inspired. Hearing those words reminded me why I'd embarked on this path in the first place. As August waned, Eleanor and I took a rare weekend off. We drove northwest to a lakeside cabin. No Wi-Fi, no studio tasks, just the lapping water and a single guitar I'd brought along. We spent hours talking about where we'd been and where we wanted to go. New satellite workshops in Milwaukee, podcasts interviewing Underdog artists globally, even writing a book about our journey. By the campfire, we strummed tunes and shared half-formed melodies, feeling the same spark of possibility that ignited our first meeting in Logan Square. Returning to Chicago on Monday, I felt recharged and clear. Underdog music was no longer a fledgling dream, but a living, breathing movement. And though we'd faced financial tightropes and moments of self-doubt, each challenge had forged us stronger. As I walked through Sonar's open door, violin case in hand, I knew our story still had many chapters to write, and that every note we played, every artist we uplifted, would echo far beyond these studio walls. September brought a crisp clarity to Chicago's skyline and to Underdog music's ambitions. Our Evanston space was humming. The Chicago Public Library Partnership had wound down for the school year, and the Berlin licensing deal was set to roll out next month. Yet, as I reviewed our quarterly reports, enrollment numbers, streaming statistics, grant milestones, I felt a familiar unease. Growth was good, but was I losing sight of our original mission? One late afternoon, I slipped into Sonar's control room just as Elena was wrapping up a call with a potential corporate sponsor. Their offer was tempting, a substantial cash infusion in exchange for branding rights, and a mention in every promotional graphic. I listened as Elena negotiated harder terms, insisting on a small logo, no creative veto. When she hung up, she looked at me, eyes serious. They Really want to be part of Underdog music, she said. This could stabilize our budget for years. I watched the sunlight fade through the blinds and quietly asked, "At what cost?" She sighed. "They've agreed to our terms. But I'm worried. Are we selling out?" We sat in the dimming room, noting the hum of the mixing board's idle channels. I thought back to the first time I played for Elena in that Logan Square hallway, raw and unfiltered. "Let's revisit our advisory board's guidelines," I suggested. "If we move forward, it must preserve our sliding scale policy, our mobile workshops, our annual free day. No exceptions." The next morning, we convened our advisory board. Artist representatives, community leaders, and even my brother Tristan in his newfound role as our legal advisor. We laid out the sponsorship proposal in full. Voices around the table, Rayna's, Jay's, Dr. Patel's, raised concerns about corporate influence, then acknowledged the practical benefits. Finally, Tristan spoke. "We can accept, but only if we codify every safeguard. Let's amend our bylaws so any sponsor must be ratified by 2/3 of the board and agree to zero editorial control." The room fell silent, then nodded in unison. With renewed confidence, we accepted the sponsorship under those conditions. The funds arrived within weeks, enabling us to expand our mobile workshops to 5 additional neighbourhoods, hire 2 teaching assistants for the Lakeview programme, and upgrade our Berlin distribution agreement to include vinyl pressings. Yet, even as we celebrated these victories, unexpected turbulence struck. Marcus, our spoken-word collaborator, whose raw truths had helped define hidden frequencies, announced he was leaving the city for a year-long residency abroad. His final project with us was a live podcast series, Underdog Chronicles, featuring interviews with emerging artists. Suddenly, I faced the task of producing episodes without the very voice that had anchored the series. I felt panic knot my chest as I listened back to Marcus's pilot episode, his gentle questions eliciting stories of resilience and creativity. How could I helm the series without him? The next morning, I rehearsed at home, playing a tentative violin melody Marcus had used as his intro theme. I realised that the essence of the podcast wasn't a single voice, but the shared belief that every story mattered. With that in mind, I invited Priya and Simone to co-host rotating episodes, each bringing fresh perspectives from film, production, and composition. The first new Underdog Chronicles episode debuted in early October. It featured 3 guests: a muralist who turned abandoned buildings into canvases, a beatboxer who taught workshops in juvenile halls, and a flamenco dancer who fused her heritage with modern storytelling. As I guided the conversation, weaving in my violin cues and occasional reflections on our journey, I felt Marcus's spirit present. His commitment to authenticity carried on through every exchange. That night, as I uploaded the final audio file, I understood that evolution is not betrayal. It's necessary adaptation. Underdog Music had grown beyond 2 passionate founders in a loft to a multifaceted movement. Our mission, to amplify overlooked voices, remained intact, even as we navigated sponsorships, partnerships, and personnel changes. I closed my laptop and picked up my violin, playing a soft, looping phrase that echoed through the empty studio. In each note, I heard the laughter of workshop students, the applause of festival crowds, and the quiet determination of artists daring to be heard. And I knew that in embracing change while safeguarding our core values, Underdog Music's story would continue to resonate, stronger and truer than ever. By late autumn, a sense of grounded momentum had settled over Underdog Music. Our expanded mobile workshops were reaching deep into South and West Side neighbourhoods. Late-night voices, live streams maintained a steady audience, and vinyl pressings of hidden frequencies were finally rolling off the Berlin press. Yet, as I sat at my desk one grey morning, journaling ideas for our next initiatives, I felt a gentle but insistent tug. a longing to return to the spark of our beginnings, to reignite the intimate connection that first drew me to Eleanor and to this work. That afternoon, I proposed a Story and Strings series, a monthly event in Sonar's Loft where one guest artist shares a personal narrative on vulnerability, survival, or transformation, accompanied by a live string quartet arrangement. No flashy production, just raw stories and the warmth of acoustic resonance. Elena's eyes lit up. It's like an evolution of Marcus's podcast and our dawn sessions combined, she said. We sketched out a pilot schedule. 4 artists for the winter season, each chosen for the power of their story as much as their artistry. Our first featured storyteller was Tamika Lee, a spoken word poet who had once led our mobile workshops in Pilsen. She arrived early one evening with a battered notebook full of pages and a quiet intensity. We gathered chairs around the control room's grand piano and set up a quartet of borrowed cellos and violins in the corner, their wooden bodies gleaming under the string lights. Tamika took a slow, steady breath and began recounting what it meant to find her voice in the shadow of systemic neglect, how she first wrote lines of protest on subway walls at midnight, and how those lines became songs carried by buskers in her neighborhood. As she spoke, I improvised a cello motif that mirrored the tension in her words, first hesitant, then swelling into a resolute pulse. When her story reached its climax, I switched to my violin, weaving a soaring counter-melody that lifted her final line. We are the authors of our own echoes into the rafters. The room was hushed, every listener leaning forward. When the last note died, the hush gave way to tears and soft applause. In that moment, I felt an electric connection, one that reminded me of my first raw performance in Logan Square, but magnified by the depth of shared experience. Elena hugged me afterward, whispering, "We needed this." Over the next 3 months, Story and Strings featured a jazz vocalist whose survival from homelessness shaped her improvisations, a visual artist who masked her pain in bright murals, and a filmmaker whose childhood trauma fueled her drive to document untold histories. Each time, I composed bespoke string arrangements that honoured the tone and rhythm of their narratives, learning to listen not just with my ears but with my heart. Meanwhile, Underdog Music's institutional growth continued. A second NEA grant allowed us to pilot a travelling music and memory programme in nursing homes, and our Berlin partner reported steady European streams. Yet, Story and Strings remained my favourite project, an anchor of intimacy amid the whirlwind of expansion. It reminded me that at our core, we were storytellers, not merely service providers. On the eve of our 15th Story and Strings event, marking our 5-year anniversary, I found myself tuning my violin in a softly lit sonar. Eleanor joined, holding 2 mugs of hot tea. We shared a quiet smile, the unspoken understanding that this journey had been as much about personal transformation as communal empowerment. "Do you ever think we could have imagined all this back in Logan Square?" she asked. I shook my head, voice thick with emotion. "Number, but I wouldn't trade the uncharted path for anything." She handed me a tea mug. "2 uncharted paths," she toasted. I lifted my violin bow. "And to the echoes we've yet to write." We sipped our tea as the final stragglers entered, readying for a night of stories and strings, proof that even as Underdog Music grew, we kept faith with the quiet beginnings that made it possible. The night of the 15th, Story and Strings was alive with anticipation. Sonar's Loft, transformed by flickering candles and framed photographs of past events, buzzed with a warm, anticipatory hum. Our advisory board members, artists, long-time students, and even my parents mingled, clutching mugs of spiced cider. Outside, a light snowfall dusted the city in white, Chicago's way of gifting us a quiet celebration. Elena and I took our places near the quartet, 2 violins, cello, and upright bass, while our guest storyteller, Naomi Chen, waited backstage. Naomi was a spoken word artist whose words about cultural displacement had captivated our first Story and Strings community workshop. Tonight, she'd share the final chapter of her journey, returning to her grandmother's village in Taiwan to reclaim her heritage. As the lights dimmed, I drew the bow across my strings, coaxing a soft tremolo that pulsed beneath Naomi's entrance. She took the stage, voice steady but brimming with emotion. She spoke of rice paddies where her grandmother once worked, of childhood stories told under paper lanterns, and of the ache of growing up between two cultures. Each line was a bridge, carrying the weight of generations. I responded with a melodic phrase on my violin, simple, plaintive, echoing the rhythm of her words. Behind me, the bass and cello built a warm foundation, while the second violin provided glimmering harmonics that danced like fireflies. With every rise and fall of Naomi's voice, our quartet wove in counterpoints, long, sustained notes to emphasize loss, crisp staccatos to mark moments of discovery, and gentle pizzicato that felt like footsteps along winding paths. When Naomi concluded with the line, "I found my home in the space between," I moved to center stage and let the music carry that truth upward. As the final chord resonated, the room held its breath. Then applause broke like a wave, full, reverent, and deeply heartfelt. Backstage afterward, I hugged Naomi. Tears shone in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You made my story come alive in ways I never imagined." Elena joined us, handing each of us a commemorative program listing all 50 guests we'd featured over 5 years. Our journey, from Logan Square recitals to community workshops, festival stages, university residencies, and national grants, was laid out in ink and imagery, a testament to the power of persistence and collaboration. As the loft emptied, I packed away my violin, every motion deliberate. My parents approached, my mother's hand warm on my shoulder. "You gave so many people a voice," she said, voice catching. My father nodded, pride softening his usual reserve. Tristan, now our legal advisor, clapped me on the back. Even he looked moved. Eleanor and I stood in the quiet aftermath, the studio charged with memories. "We made something real," I said. She smiled, eyes reflective. "Something lasting." We turned off the lights, leaving behind the glow of candles long extinguished. Outside, the snow continued to fall, settling on empty streets and echoing the hush of possibility. As we locked the door and walked toward the L car, its windshield frosted white, we carried with us the knowledge that Underdog music's story was far from over. Each note we'd played, each story we'd uplifted, and each life we'd touched had become part of a larger symphony. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought back to the girl who once shrank into corners and whispered her melodies into empty rooms. She would be proud of how loudly we learned to play, and in that quiet, I realized, even the softest echo can become a chorus when enough voices come together.